Hey folks, this is Kathy Barrett. I'm with Cornell PRODAIRY's program, and I want to welcome you to this webinar, a dairy update webinar. Today we have Joe Lawrence, my colleague with PRODAIRY, who's going to be talking about corn silage hybrid trials he's done, as well as corn silage management in general. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We record these webinars so that people can listen to them at a later date when maybe it's more convenient for them, or if you folks wanted to go back and re-listen to something that you'd heard and wanted to clarify. So we do record these. We also allow questions back and forth, but what we ask with this size group, there's about 30 of you, if you would just put your questions in the chat box, and I'll keep track of them, and we'll ask Joe those questions as they come. I think that's about all the housekeeping. So I imagine most of you folks know Joe, but he is our forage management specialist here for PRODAIRY, and he does a lot of work in this whole area of hybrid testing and corn silage management. And so we thought this would be a good time just before fieldwork really gets going to kind of review some of the things that he's learned through his trials, but also just some management type of things. So Joe, with that, can I just kind of hand it off to you?
Sounds good.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for joining everyone. So, yeah, Kathy and I brainstormed this before everything went haywire the last couple of weeks here. So I have changed up and added a few slides just because of that, and I also changed it a little bit to be more comprehensive for the growing season instead of just necessarily taking a deep dive into the spring and hybrids, but just more comprehensive of the growing season in general as we think about how we plan ahead and what contingency plans we might need with some of the unknowns. And then I just threw in this to start with because this has been widely shared on email and whatnot, but just wanted to take another opportunity to say there's a fair amount of information out there that can be helpful on the farm or for the agri-service sector supporting the farms. So just wanted to throw in some of these links to start with here. So getting into what we're thinking about today, and one thing we talk a lot about with corn silage or our forages in general, I should say, is what can we impact and what can't we impact. Some of you have seen before some of the research we've been doing with fiber digestibility and seeing how that can be really tied to the weather conditions we're having, and not as much so to hybrid selection. So how do we focus in on that and make sure that we're spending our time and resources on the things that we can control and have the most impact on our operation. And I really like to always start out with this slide from Dr. Kung in Delaware that really points out that it's a two-step process to get good quality forages in front of the cow. We have to start out with good forage quality, and then we have to continue that on through the silage making and storage process. So, thinking about the growing season ahead, what are the biggest risks in obtaining the needed forage you need? And, we've been talking a lot more the last few years about having the right quality forage for different groups of animals, and whether it's a needed quantity or quality that you need for certain animal groups. And then what role does corn silage really play in this? There's certainly some risk just related to the weather, and especially on more variable soils in terms of our ability to get on the field, access in a timely manner. Unfortunately, we may, because of the coronavirus issues, we may have more labor concerns this year than normal in terms of timely field operations. and how do we mitigate those risks? And we'll get into some of that. I just threw this one in here today because hopefully it doesn't get to this, but worst case scenario, we often talk about the timeliness of hay harvest in the spring and getting a good quality first cutting and the importance of that. But we know farms are also feeding higher corn silage diets. And we know that there's been some, we're coming off a few years of questionable inventory. So hopefully it doesn't come to this, but if we do start having labor related issues with health problems, how do we make those decisions about what our highest priorities are? Because yes, getting good quality first cutting is definitely a priority, and it's still ideal to do that. But if you're feeding a high corn silage diet, and that's representing a significant part of what the cows are getting, then obviously getting that corn in and getting those acres planted so that you have adequate inventory next fall is has to take precedent. If you're not feeding a higher corn silage diet, then maybe, right, you have to balance it a little differently. But the other thing to think about from, the extremes that we might be facing in terms of hay crops is that, that requires multiple cutting events every summer. And so how do we manage those and with, potential disruptions to labor versus corn, which is one timing for planting and harvest, obviously busy times, but nonetheless not the multiple events needed for hay. So how might that change your thinking if labor is a potential concern this year? So just jumping right into it, something, when we talk about risk and what we can and can't control, we know we really can't control the weather, but hopefully we can try to manage for the weather, even though we can't manage it. And we've seen growing seasons where it's like last year, it started off wet, and by the middle of the summer, we saw some pineapple corn, right? And having the extremes of both in the same year. I saw some interesting data last fall at a conference for the Northeast where it showed that compared to 50 years ago, we're getting about on average about 5 more inches of precipitation per year. But what was more notable to me, especially when we think about corn silage harvest, is that this extra 5 inches of precip wasn't evenly distributed throughout the 12 months of the year. 75% of it was coming in the fall of the year. And we certainly know we've had a couple challenging harvest seasons recently related to wet conditions. And, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that we need to be prepared for more of that. And I'm going to focus in on that a little bit with a few slides coming up in terms of thinking about the relative maturities that we're selecting and how that fits into the these sort of challenges in the fall of the year. So what are the big influences and which one on corn silage and which ones can we have the biggest impact on? So certainly picking maturities that fit our growing season, and I'm going to argue here that maybe even going a little shorter season than we think is what is comfortable for our growing season. We can have some impact on starch by selecting hybrids. We know that starch content is simply a calculation of ear to stover ratio. So if you have more stover relative to the ear, it dilutes out the your actual starch percentage. That doesn't mean there's less starch in terms of what the plant produced for an ear. It just means it was more diluted out. And then certainly getting the crop mature in the fall. Fiber digestibility, we have options, unique genetics like BMR that offer some things that we can potentially select and control there, but also there's a lot to fiber digestibility that we just don't have a lot of control over because of how it's driven by weather. And then certainly on the crop hygiene side, as we think about not just the growing process, but the silage process is crop hygiene, clean crop, limiting pest damage, limiting molds and toxins. So over the years also, as we've tried to build more cover crops or even double crops into our rotation, it's really been a whole change in mindset, because we don't really need to, or we shouldn't just think about it in terms of adding a cover crop into our current rotation. Oftentimes that just leads to frustration and marginal benefits. What we really need to think about is actually changing our whole rotation so that all the crops we want to grow to fit into it. And oftentimes one of the most obvious places to do that is just shortening up our corn hybrid relative maturities in order to give us flexibility with our planting and harvest windows to go along with timely planting and potential harvest of a cover crop. Because we know that if we just try to slam in a cover crop after the traditional corn hybrids we've been growing, we're likely to have limited success, because we're not setting the whole system up to fit and work together. So diving into specifically into relative maturities as it relates to hybrid selection, really, again, matching not just the growing season you have, but the crop rotation you have, and how do we fit that in there? So using the trials we do here in New York and Vermont as a platform, we're able to pull off some data that, in addition to just reporting the hybrid results, that allows us to have a little better understanding of some of this stuff. So, this is, again, our locations for the trials across New York and Vermont, and here's our 2019 numbers. I'm happy to say that we are working on the 2020 trials. At this point, things are subject to change, I guess, but at this point, everything's still a go in terms of doing field work, and our crew is working on sorting seed for the different trial locations, while also social distancing, I guess. So that's a bit of a challenge, but we are moving forward, and we got a nice entries for 2020. Actually, our numbers are up a little bit from 2019, so that's nice to see the support from all the companies. So if we look at weather data and how that relates to some of our forage quality data, I think the next two slides are kind of interesting, because here we see the last 3 years, both precipitation and growing degree days. And what we see is that there was a variation by year. We don't need much of a reminder that 2017 in general for a lot of New York was cool and very wet, where 2018 was on average a little better growing season. And then we see by the solid bars, the blue and green bars here, that 2019 kind of seemed to fall in between 2017 and 2018 in terms of weather. And what's interesting is if we pick a couple of our forage quality parameters that we look at, we see kind of the same thing. We see the yellow line here being 2019, where those performance from starch and looking at UNDF 240 as indicators of quality, both kind of fell in between 2017 and 2018. And the way to look at this is it's the percent of samples from our trials that fell into each of these ranges. So for example, 2017 starch, the highest percentage of samples had a starch between 32 and 34, where we see both in 2018 and 2019, that peak in starch is shifted to the right, which means it was a higher percentage of the total samples had a higher starch content. So, that's really driven by the heat units we got and the maturity of the crop at harvest, right? We see the same trend with UNDF 240, except it's the reverse, because in this case, lower numbers are better. So we want to see a lower number for this undigested NDF value. But we see the same kind of trend, but for a slightly different reason. It wasn't necessarily due to the cool conditions and the crop not being able to mature properly and dry down properly for harvest, like maybe with the starch. It was more related to rainfall. And again, we see 2017 with a very high rainfall, and we see the largest number of samples peak out at 13 or 14, where the last 2 years we see the samples peak in the 9 to 10 or 11 to 12 range, so more digestible stuff based on the growing season on average across all of our samples. Another thing I like to bring up about this data is in terms of selecting hybrids. So whatever company you decide to work with to get your corn seed from, I think it's helpful to calibrate yourself to the growing season we've had. So a good example of this was UNDF 240. If you picked an arbitrary number and said, I want a UNDF 240 of 10 for my hybrids, well, that would have been pretty darn easy to get from almost any hybrid on the market in 2018, or even less so in 2019. But you still would have had, any given company would have had a pretty easy time giving you a selection of hybrids that hit that number in those 2 years. However, in 2017, if you were looking at hybrid data from 2017, it would have been nearly impossible to hit that mark of a UNDF 240 of around 10. So, rather than picking some sort of absolute value or arbitrarily saying I want a starch of this level or a UNDF of this level, I think it's really helpful to use this sort of data to calibrate yourself to the growing season and say, well, here's what kind of the average was for this growing season. So how do your given hybrids compare to those averages? Are they on track? Are they a little better, or did they struggle even in relative to their peers in this growing season? So getting more into the hybrid environment interactions, just to throw in a few more things. This is an example of some data from our 2016 trials where we had the same hybrids planted at 2 locations in Aurora and Madrid. Similar total rainfall, both had rainfall well below the 10-year average for rainfall. But there was a pretty big difference in the manner in which this rainfall came in the months that we had the rainfall. Aurora was really drought stressed, and not only that, by these numbers, but a lot of the rain in June came in early June, and most of that rain in August or in July came at the end of July. So we had almost a 2-month stretch with very little water, and the crop showed it. It was a very drought stressed crop. But when we look at the crop yields and our predicted milk production from these hybrids, again, it was the exact same hybrids at both locations. We see that the blue bars in Madrid yielded quite well, even though rainfall was below normal. We had timely rainfall when the crop needed it, and it yielded quite well at that location. But in terms of predicted milk production, it wasn't as high as Aurora. That crop wasn't quite as digestible. We look at the Aurora numbers, we had a much more digestible crop, higher predicted milk production, but yields suffered quite a bit because of the growing season we had. So this is just a 1-year data set, but I've always thought it was a good one to show that contrast and show that oftentimes there's a bigger difference between locations with the same genetics than there is between different genetics at the same location.
Joe, this is Kathy. Can I just interrupt Real
Yep.
quick for a question that you may have alluded to here, the answer, but we have a question. It says, you talked about starch and UNDF 240 between years, but what was the tonnage difference between years?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't actually, I might have that if, let's see if this is going to let me do something here. I was trying to make room for a few extra slides, so so hopefully everyone's seeing a table now with whole plot averages for the 3 years. So again, this is whole plot, which is the same with the starch, but you can see here in a different format, we still have the starch and the UNDF 240 values here, similar to that that line chart I showed you before, but the yields are also present here on average. So the black numbers are by location and the blue numbers are averaged across the 3 locations for the entire year. But if that's helpful at all to the question.
Okay.
And we can get, we can circle back to that as well. So we've also partnered with Penn State and the PDMP program and Western New York Crop Management and the University of Maine to try to collect more data across the entire Northeast region. And what we've had the last few years is we've had a few hybrids that have been entered in multiple trials. So it gives us the opportunity to see the same genetics across multiple locations. So in 2018, there were 4 hybrids that were entered in trials in Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, and Maine, I believe. Although is the Maine data on here? May not be. And then in 2019, we had 3 hybrids at 8 different locations. And that gives us another opportunity to look at the difference that location has versus the difference of the same or different genetics at the same location. And so here's some of those numbers, again, similar to the last one in terms of yield, NDF digestibility, and starch. And then this next one is this is the range in differences. So the solid bars represent the difference between locations. So for example, this, again, averaging these 3 or 4 hybrids together across multiple locations, there was about a 7-point difference in NDFD 30 values across locations in 2019, and a little over an 8-point difference in values in 2018. But if we look at the crosshatch ones, that's the different hybrids at the same location. So again, we had these different hybrids, different genetics, and there was only a 2-point difference in their performance at the same location. But when we looked at them as a group and compared them to the other locations, there was on average a 7 or 8-point difference. And we see that same trend playing through with these 4 different characteristics that I selected out to show here. So again, just highlighting that location has a lot to do with this, and management in terms of harvest timing, especially on the starch and total yield side. But so how do you look at this? Well, I think all the companies have really robust hybrids out there on the market. They wouldn't be bringing them to market if they weren't competitive. So it's really picking what's the right fit for your farm, picking the right pest management practices, pest management traits, and focusing in on some of that stuff. And when we think about the weather and this fiber digestibility piece, I had taken a snapshot of this newsletter from August of 2017 because, as we think about, well, we can't turn the rainfall on and off, so how do we affect fiber digestibility? Well, we can't really, unless we're under irrigation somewhere. But But what we can do is kind of predict ahead, and Rick Grant up at Minor Institute wrote this article in their newsletter in August of 2017 saying, hey, we've had a pretty heavy rainfall summer. We probably have high UNDF levels in our forages coming with this year's crop. And if we predict that before we even harvest the crop, it gives us some time to plan out what our ration is going to look like come December or January when we start feeding out that corn silage. So while we maybe can't change the rainfall, we can think about how it helps us manage and plan out our ration needs as we feed the new crop. So I'm going to spend a little time on relative maturities, and this may seem like an old topic, but I think it has a lot of importance in today's world as we kind of evolve our systems for the type of weather we've been dealing with. And we often think about yield increases relative to longer season corns. And there's some data out there on grain related to that. And there's some similar considerations with grain. You get a longer season crop, but you still want it to dry down so that you don't have to spend a fortune on drying it if it's grain, but it applies to silage even more so. And Bill Cox had summarized some data several years ago that showed that you got about a 0.5 ton acre increase in yield with every 5 days you went up in length of your corn silage. And and there's in the big picture, when you average it across multiple years, that is true. But it also assumes that you're able to get that crop to the same dry matter to harvest to realize that 0.5 ton per acre difference. And if you're not able to get the crop to the same dry matter, then you can quickly negate any of those potential yield benefits. Just a few examples of that. Say we get into the mud season and we're forced to raise up the cutter bar. Well, a summary of some studies on cutting height out of Penn State shows about a 6-inch reduction in yield, a 1 ton reduction in yield for going up 6 inches. So if we have to raise that because we're sinking in the mud, if we take an 18 ton per acre yield, 1 ton is about 5.5%. And if we look at what 0.5 ton per acre represents at some different yields in this little blue table, we see that 0.5 ton per acre only represents about 2 to 3% of a yield. If we're ranging from 18 to 25 ton yields. So we could be forced to raise our cutter bar because we're in the mud and quickly give up twice as much yield as we might have gained by going with a slightly longer relative maturity corn. Plus we get into feed hygiene issues when we're playing in the mud. Again, wet silage, sorry, I apologize for the cough here. We know it doesn't ferment as well. We know we give up some dry matter yield. And we have, potential for higher shrink losses during fermentation and storage. So again, if we're only gaining 2 or 3% of yield with that increase, but we're getting wetter silage, it doesn't take long to lose that 2 or 3% with extra shrink in the storage. And then frost. I didn't really know how to quantify frost, but again, if we have issues with fermentation or incomplete maturity of the kernels, we're going to give up a lot more yield than what we gained by going with a longer season hybrid. We had the opportunity to look at this a couple years ago with our Vermont study, where we had 4 hybrids that were planted on the exact same day and then harvested 1 week apart. So our 2 harvest dates on these 4 hybrids were September 12th and September 19th. And it was a good week of drying weather. We often talk about we can get a half to 1 point a day dry down if we have good drying weather. So here in 7 days, we got about just shy of 5 points of dry down. So that was a pretty good week of drying. The other thing I draw your attention to on the whole plant dry matter is that even on September 12th, it was already 32%. And we often talk about 32% being the starting point of our range for dry down or for harvest. We often talk about 35% being an ideal place to be, but we say, well, if it's 32, we can get started. But look at what we give up at 32% in this scenario. Well, first, I guess I'll start with the fiber digestibility. It might change slightly, but basically corn is an overmature grass. It's already lost some of its fiber digestibility once it tassels out. So unless you're going to harvest corn as a grass pre-tasseling like you try to harvest any other grass, we're really not going to change fiber digestibility a whole lot, and it's not expected to change much this late in the season because it's already dropped off after tasseling. But when we think about starch content, we know that as the kernels dry down, we're getting more starch, and we're also getting more dried matter yield. And when we look at those numbers there, we saw that 1 week difference in timing allowed us to get considerably higher starch content and a higher yield. Now, do I think that these numbers would be replicated every single growing season by waiting 7 days? No, I don't. But they're big enough numbers that even if you cut them in half and said, but by waiting 7 days, even if you cut those numbers in half, you still see some pretty meaningful gains there. And again, a gain of a ton or more of silage per acre just by waiting for it to dry down could be better than going with a longer season relative maturity. And so what's the point of all this? Well, if you with the type of fall conditions we've been having, if you go with a slightly shorter season corn, you're hopefully putting yourself in the driver's seat in terms of your harvest date. So you get to pick the harvest date and you get to wait that extra week because it's actually maturing on time. Conversely, if we don't do that, then we're not in the driver's seat anymore, and we may be forced to take it at a wetter stage because of Mother Nature. So it just, thinking about how do you put yourself in the driver's seat for your harvest timing decisions. Now jumping back to the beginning of the season and just thinking about like how important is it to get that corn planted this spring. And we've often talked about parking the corn planter and getting first cutting, and I still think there's a lot of truth to that. It's very important, especially if we're relying on that first cutting as a lactating quality feed. But at the same time, we do have to be careful. And there was a study out of Wisconsin several years ago. Oh, sorry, I guess I'm jumping ahead. But so first of all, what does planting date mean to us? That's what the next slide is. So these bars represent the average number of growing degree days we get in 10-day increments at 6 different locations across New York State. And we see them really peak out with these 10-day increments in July. So under our normal planting timing in early May or something, we've already tasseled and we're in early July usually, and we're capturing these heat units in mid-July to help that crop out. Where if we have a year like 2019 where we had wet conditions and planting was delayed, or we're delayed in planting for other reasons, like we're trying to harvest a double crop of a winter cover crop or something, and we delay planting, then we miss some of those windows in the middle of July, and now we're relying on growing degree days in September and October to finish off the crop. And here we see that you get out into the end of September, October, like we did last year, and it takes 20 days to get a similar number of growing degree days as you would have gotten in 10 days back in July. And so that's why that rule of thumb of like 6 to 7 weeks from tasseling to silage harvest is really not applicable, and we might as well throw it out the window, because that 6 to 7 week rule of thumb, is based on a lot of assumptions of when that crop tassels and how many growing degree days we're going to get. Where if we get off of that schedule at all, we're just not going to get those growing degree days in that 6 to 7 week period. So what do we give up? A couple interesting charts. The one on the left is kind of busy. It was in an article out of Wisconsin that was pretty interesting, talking about kind of the two peaks of corn silage quality. And again, kind of making the point that the first peak, when you get the maximum fiber digestibility, is prior to tasseling. But then the next peak, and why we're willing to give up some of that fiber digestibility, is because we're going after the extra yield that and the starch that comes from the grain fill. So thinking about these two peaks in silage quality, and this other chart is reflecting the differences in yield at different harvest stages. So again, if we have to harvest an immature crop, we're giving up a lot of yield. So this Wisconsin study, and these dates might be a little different than New York compared to Wisconsin, but it gives you an idea. And one of the reasons from a yield standpoint that we talk about parking the corn planter is that we see here that they achieved 95% of their maximum yield basically through late May at all three locations. However, after late May, you get into late May or early June, and all of a sudden yield potential per day starts to drop off more rapidly. But the other thing they saw related to this is that on the forage quality side is that once you got past mid-May, the rate of forage quality decline was more notable, especially in the central and northern zones where the crop didn't necessarily have time to finish off the way they wanted it to. So there might be more of a quality penalty on that side than a yield penalty if we're in middle to late May. So just a reminder on planting dates is once we put that corn in the ground, we do we would like to see 50-degree temperatures and drier soils. I would say that the drier soils are more important than the temperature these days in a lot of cases. If you mud in a crop, can have some real consequences. If the soil is still fairly cool, if you're using a hybrid with a seed treatment on it, then we can be fairly resistant to early season pest pressures, and our modern hybrids have pretty good vigor in the spring of the year. As I said at the beginning, I changed this around to jump around to whole season management a little bit from our original intentions, but just wanted to bring up a few other things because, again, another big component of thinking about managing our corn crop is the nitrogen and making sure we're feeding the crop correctly. So we had a study funded the last couple of years here in New York by corn growers in the Northern New York Ag Development Program, looking at variability between hybrids grown at the same locations in our trials in terms of nitrogen use efficiency. So we're actually still kind of summarizing some of this data. We don't have it all together yet, but what we've seen from the initial results is it certainly suggests that higher yielding crops are actually more efficient at taking up nitrogen than lower yielding crops. So in other words, the whole idea that to get more yield, you need to put more nitrogen down, we're seeing more data that suggests that that doesn't hold up, that we don't necessarily need more nitrogen to get more yield, that we have, especially in our dairy systems, we have quite a bit of nitrogen there if we've had manure on the fields, and we see these sort of things popping up like this. This isn't the first study that's shown that our higher yielding crops tend to actually be more efficient in their use of nitrogen. This is some older data out of Penn State, but it's kind of showing that some of that same stuff here. It's showing that nitrogen uptake is really correlated with yield. However, the optimum rate of nitrogen is not well correlated with yield. So, you know, again, there's not necessarily, we can't necessarily say that there's an economic optimum N rate that's directly correlated with a maximum yield. Some data from the Nutrient Management Spear program with looking similarly at nitrogen applied to nitrogen removed. And in this case, you know, again, we see that hybrid or fields that were below 90% of their yield potential did not use the nitrogen as efficiently, where our higher yielding fields that yielded above their yield potential tended to, you know, trend towards a higher nitrogen efficiency. So shifting gears, and again, Kathy mentioned before, but throw out any questions you have. You know, just to the harvest and management side, that may seem like a long ways away right now, but again, if we're thinking about putting ourselves in the driver's seat and making sure we're ready for harvest and the implications there, I just thought it was still relevant to cover that, because as we get busy with the growing season, it's not a bad thing to be thinking about. And also some of it applies to hay harvest as well. So I like this quote. It was in a Horace Dairyman interview that was done a while back, or I guess just a few months back. But you know, despite our best efforts, we always end up with forage that is below our quality standards due to the weather and other challenges. The parts we can control include processing, fill, pack, and cover. So, you know, are you geared up? Is your equipment ready? Is your labor force ready? And are you ready to tackle the parts and make sure you spend the time on the stuff you can control? When we think about harvest timing, growing degree days from planting, there's some fancy apps out there you can put on your smartphone now that you can plug in your planting date and it'll predict the harvest timing. And those are a good early season indicator to give you somewhat of an idea, but they can be highly variable, because we know, you know, for example, from planting date till tasseling, there can be 100 or more growing degree day variation just to get to tasseling. So that when you're looking at the whole season, that kind of throws it off. Again, I'd throw that 6 to 7 week rule of thumb out the window. And so Bill Cox had done some work at looking at silking to silage harvest, because that takes out that early season variability of getting to the silking or tasseling stage. And that still can be a little variable, but it at least takes out the early season variability. It is an extra step to get out there and make some notes as you drive around looking at your fields of when they're silking, because generally we have planting dates written down. We don't necessarily have silking dates written down, but it is a more accurate system. And one important thing with Bill's work is that these growing degree days were to reach 32% dry matter. So again, this could kind of act as an early warning system, and we'd really rather be waiting for it to dry down a few more points, but it gives you a heads up of where to look. And there's this nice, there's, in addition to a lot of other apps that are out there, the Climate Smart Farming program at Cornell does offer a nice tool where you can plug in your location and planting date and look at growing degree days and target of when you're going to hit growing degree days. And another thing is, you don't have to use planting date, even though it says planting date here. You could put in tasseling date in this box and it would give you the same information. So use growing degree days as an early warning system. Don't use kernel milk line, and really focus on getting good, accurate whole plant dry matters to harvest from. You know, a few other things, again, maybe we don't want to be forced to raise the cutter bar because of mud in the field, but it can be a strategy if we have a bumper crop and we're not sure where we're going to put all the inventory. Raising our cutter bar can be a strategy to get a little more yield and quality, or sorry, a little less yield but more quality. If we see a good growing season. Kernel processing continues to be important. Just a quick reminder there. We've often gotten the question of, does kernel processing score increase during silage fermentation? We've had a study going the last couple of years looking at corn harvester performance and evaluating kernel processing of different harvesters. And so basically this is a little example here. This isn't real data, but if processing score increased with time in fermentation, we'd expect to see a bar graph like that. This is the type of bar graph we've seen over the last couple seasons. So looking at 4 different hybrids and 0 to 135 days fermented, we see no consistent increase in kernel processing score just from fermentation. So what this is suggesting is that it really does matter what our processing score is with our green samples, and we can't rely on fermentation to really consistently change that for us. Just to wrap up, again, thinking about some of this applies to hay crops too, not just corn silage, but really getting the most dry matter we can into an area for good storage and minimizing shrink. Had an interesting example with a farm we worked with, thinking about how much density impacts our footprint, not just for how well the crop ferments and keeps, and the ability of, or the fact that we know density reduces shrink losses, but also just in terms of what we need for a footprint. And this farm was really struggling. They only had about 9.5 months worth of storage. It looked like a pretty clean, well-kept bunk, good tire-to-tire coverage. They were using a defacer, but they just didn't have enough inventory, so they were thinking about building a whole nother bunk, which obviously has a lot of cost to it. But then we got digging around and found their densities were only averaging about 13 pounds of dry matter, which is on the low side. So we started doing some calculations, and we said, all right, what happens if you get your density up to 18 pounds of dry matter? And we made the assumption that they would reduce shrink from 24 down to 15%. So that was an assumption made on our part. But how much could you hold in that same footprint? And that same footprint had the potential to go from 9.5 months of storage up to 14.5 months or so of storage without pouring any extra concrete. So when you think about the implications of that in terms of capital cost of building a bunk, in terms of collecting rainfall and leachate off of that bunk, in terms of how much shrink you're getting, it was a pretty easy decision to make a plan to get more packing weight on that bunk instead of going off and building a new bunk and spending all that money and still only having a density that was too low and having shrink losses that were too high. So as we think of some of the threats to a low silage density, certainly just loss of feed, loss of nutritional value, and insufficient space are all significant. So what limits density? Certainly delivery rate and packing weight. If the forage is cut too long, you might have problems. Too thick of layers in terms of not thinning it out enough when you're packing it. We really suggest 4 to 6 inch layers. A poor base, especially temporary piles. If you're packing against a soft surface, then you're always going to have issues. And that even applies to concrete, because if you're putting silage on concrete, but the first 2 or 3 feet you just kind of shove in there to get spread out and get the floor covered and out of the way, and it's not packed well, even if you start packing better on top of that, from there on out, you're always essentially packing against a sponge instead of packing against that hard concrete. And then having too little space and having slopes that aren't safe or heights that aren't safe. So we always go back to this rule of thumb of 800 pounds of packing weight per ton of forage per hour.
Joe?
Yeah.
Kathy, I hate to interrupt you, but
no, that's fine.
Further, this is a two-part question, but I just wanted to have you answer the first one before we went any further. It says is there a spreadsheet for the bunk capacity calculation that you just showed?
So this was, so this one here, no, we just did the math based on what the farm told us in terms of what they were feeding, and we made the assumption. The University of Wisconsin, if you Google University of Wisconsin Team Forage, they have a really great website, and they do have spreadsheets on their website to help predict both capacity of a storage structure as well as predict density. So you can enter in the numbers in terms of how much packing weight you have and what the delivery rate is of the silage and what layer thickness you're spreading it out at. And if you put in good numbers, it does a good job of accurately predicting what density you can achieve. So I would recommend that Team Forage webpage from Wisconsin. And if anyone wants help with this, certainly shoot me an email or give me a phone call or reach out to your local extension team or myself, either way, but I'd be happy to help anyone with any of these calculations.
Great, Joe, and we'll loop back to the other part of that question
okay.
when we wind up.
Yeah. And then so yeah, again, just making sure we have we calculate this the right packing weight, and this was a card that a few of us put together several years ago, and basically if you know your delivery rate, you just follow that over till you get into the green, and that indicates how much tractor weight you need based on your delivery rate. The other thing I like to point out is your pushing tractor only is on the bunk part of the time. And so you really shouldn't credit 100% of that tractor's weight to your packing. At best, it might only be spending 50 or 60% of its time actually packing. In terms of, some quick things to think about in terms of packing effectiveness, tire pressure may seem kind of like a silly one, but we spend a lot of time at crop meetings talking about the impact of properly inflated tires and compaction to soil. Well, it's really the same thing in our bunks, except we want to do the opposite, right? Layer thickness has a huge impact. And if you start playing around with that University of Wisconsin spreadsheet in terms of adjusting the layer thickness, so if you leave your delivery rate and your packing weight and everything the same and just play around with the layer thickness, you can see how much that changes the predicted densities you'll get. Lots of different creative strategies for adding weight. And then, certainly keeping your slopes of your ramp less steep so that you're not really chewing up, first of all, for safety, but second of all, for, as you try to push up, if you're trying to push up on too steep of a slope. And then fill rate. Can you fill multiple bunks at one time to allow for more tractors to get on or something? And if you're in a situation where you have a narrow bunk and you're limited to how many tractors you can actually fit on it. Oh, and actually I forgot I had an example in here related to packing weight and layer thickness, but here, so I used the University of Wisconsin spreadsheet, and I had the same, again, all the numbers were the same, and I looked at a 6-inch layer thickness. So if you just had one push tractor on there, and it was only packing 56% of the time, the projected density would be 12. If you add a second tractor on there and it's dedicated just to packing, and it's packing, almost 100% of the time, that still only gets your density up to 13. And you got to get 4 tractors on that bunk with that 6-inch layer thickness for this to predict a density of 16. If you just get that layer thickness down to 4 inches, then we see that just that push tractor feasibly gets you to 14, and a second tractor gets you up to 16 or better, where it took 4 tractors with a thicker layer thickness to get up to 16. So, this is being predicted by the spreadsheet. Are these numbers 100% exact? No, but I think it gives you a pretty good flavor of what sort of difference something like layer thickness can make. So just to wrap up here, whether it's planting or harvest timing, we often make split second decisions because of a broken packing tractor, or an employee that doesn't show up and you're down 1 packing tractor that day, or you decide to mud in the corn, or you decide to shift up a gear with your planter tractor because you're running behind. All of those split second decisions can have huge impacts on the forages we have for the next 12 months. And certainly, with all due respect to this being a very an abnormally stressful time coming into what's typically a busy and stressful time on farms, just thinking about all the things you can do to put in a plan in place to affect this and avoid having to make these sort of decisions that might come back to haunt you. So that's here's my contact information. Again, if any of this information or any of those bunk calculations, if you want to reach out and go through some of that, happy to. And any other questions?
Okay, so we do have a question here, Joe. So with wetter fall harvest season on average, we grow longer season hybrids and harvest later and mud the corn out. Could the resulting compaction just reduce the yield of the next corn crop as much as we may have gained with the longer season hybrid?
I think that's an excellent point. I honestly hadn't even really thought about it in that context, but certainly as we adding soil health and what we're learning about soil health to this whole picture, and the implications of a poor soil health on, and something like mudding corn in or mudding it out that impacts soil health is certainly another layer to add on to this. The other thing to go along with that is, especially in a state like New York with the climate we have, is if you're pushing out into that later season and in the mud to get the corn out, and not only are you impacting the soil health through compaction, you're also probably throwing any chance of getting a cover crop planted out the window by that time of year. So that's another repercussion of it.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we have, Joe. So I want to thank you for really an excellent overview and webinar. And folks, like I said, we recorded this, so you can check it out later on the PRODAIRY website, just PRODAIRY webinars, and it'll come up. And thanks everybody for taking the time to listen in today. So have a good day.
Thank you.